All right, thank you guys so much. We are plugging away through John Gebser's The Ever-Present Origin. Right now, we are doing the section of Provisional Statement of Account, Measure and Mass. So what we're going to be doing is analyzing the conceptual pair of measure and mass, and of course, measure and mass correspond to the mental structure. So ultimately, what this section is a critique of the deficient mental rational dualistic cul-de-sac that imprisons our modern world, and in doing so, is the source for a ton of huge, potentially civilizationally destroying problems. Now he uses the conceptual pair of measure and mass. Again, that there is one way to interpret that as an antithetical with the mental structure, but what he's going to do is going to say, no, there are aspects or manifestations of this conceptual pair that are magical, mythical, mental, which of course is hinting at the integral. So after all that, there's just going to be some old-fashioned cultural criticism, and I love it because it's great. So this is a really great section, and I'm excited. Excuse me. Unfortunately, there's no way I'll be able to do this entire section in one video and keep it under 2 hours. So this will be another parter, so I do apologize about that. But let's get right into it. He says, the cross-section ensuing from our discussion in the first section of this chapter, which we summarize in the first part of the synoptic table, led to various questions and symmetries which can be dealt with under the uniform heading of measure and mass. We noted in particular 4 symmetries or laws, really laws. Now remember, symmetries just means law here. It doesn't mean Wes Anderson, the left hand. You take the screen or take the shot and cut it right down the middle, and the left and the right are exactly the same. That's not what it is. 1. There is an interdependence of the incrementation, of consciousness and the increase of dimensions that result in a growing reification of the world. Thus, the problem of measure and mass, in the form of a transition from moderation to augmentation and material aggregation, as it appears here as an aspect of mass, it is seemingly a rational problem. So we're just, in many ways, these laws are the ones we covered, not in the last video, the digression on the unity primal words, but the one before that. Number 2. There is an interchange of moderation and immoderation evident in what we have described as the breathing character of our structures. This question does not present itself with a one-sided emphasis on one aspect, as in the case of mass, but rather as a polar question where exaltation is a natural consequence and complement of inhalation. It also appears as a biological question, inasmuch as it relates to breathing as a biological function, but to this we may, in turn, attach psychic polar values. Here we are faced, in other words, with a predominantly psychic problem, so of course the mythical consciousness structure. Then he goes on to say, a certain equalization, always a prerequisite of any unity, takes place between the diminution of the relationship to the whole, as we have defined it, and the increase in the powers of consciousness which create their own texture of interrelationships and apparently compensate for the diminution. Here the problem of measure and mass manifests itself as an aspect of unity, and therefore essentially as a question of magic. 4. Each individual structure has an inherent and recurring symmetry in that the qualitative, moderate, and efficient form is superseded by the quantitative, immoderate formlessness, which is deficient. Measure and mass, then, are characteristic of these 2 phases of each structure. Since we can place this symmetry into the causal context, so real quick, let's stop there. He says, measure and mass, then, are characteristics of these 2 phases of each structure. So each structure has an efficient and deficient, a measured efficient phase and a deficient phase, and that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be analyzing the efficient aspects of the mental consciousness structure, or the current day, of course, this was written in 1949, and how rationalism has screwed everything up. Measure and mass, then, are characteristic of these 2 phases of each structure. Since we can place this symmetry into the causal context, the problem poses itself in an essentially mental form. We shall see, however, that the causal nexus is manifest here as an expression of wholeness or integrality. Only an aggregation of quantification, an indication of an exhausted qualitative potency, can guarantee a new mutation which seems to emerge from quote-unquote the whole that forms the decisive element in each mutation. We can assume, on the other hand, that the mutations occurring in man strive toward or enable the integration into the whole. So this conceptual pair it's integral, as you can see. We're hinting at integrality here. It's not just the mental either-or dualism of measure and mass. It's integral. The magic has its own interpretation of it, and so does mythical and all that. Let's see. Since we know now that the terms measure and mass not only embody the antithesis that is expressed in rationalistic terms, but the polar moment and the basic unitary element as well, we can convey, through the conceptual pair as a whole, individual aspects as well as the integrality of those things and problems which, in mental terms, present themselves to us as symmetries. We are able then to keep in mind that this pair measure and mass is definitely not just an expression of antithesis, but also of a complementary and originally a unitary phenomenon. We shall be in a position to consciously affect the integrality represented both by the conceptual pair and by the sum of its individual aspects, even though we can deal with only one of those aspects at a given time. So there you go. There you have it. Take these real quick. Okay, let's see. He says, let us then venture a provisional statement of account to determine what conclusions can be drawn from the individual symmetries and observe them one after the other as to their possible consequences. He says, we are today, perhaps more than ever, of course, this is right off the back of World War II, prone to take stock and inquire into our gains and losses. Consequently, the gain or increment in dimensions of which we spoke earlier leads us directly to a consideration of the consequences of this increment of consciousness and dimensions that we have identified. So we're going over the first law. We saw how each new mutation was accompanied by a new dimension that began to take effect. Each new mutation, in other words, quote-unquote accrued a gain in dimension. And this increase of a dimension in each instance unquestionably represents quote-unquote progress. A progression we might define as one from the measure or moderation to a gradual measurelessness or immoderation of the mass. Particularly if we deemed an ever-expanding dimensioning and expansion of consciousness to be desirable. But everything depends on an intensification, not an expansion or extension of consciousness. So the idea is, of course, magic is 1D, mythical 2D, mental 3D. We're accruing these new dimensions as these structures mutate. It might lead someone to think, well, why don't we have 5D, 6D, 7D, 8D? I mean, look at all these capabilities that are afforded to us with these new consciousness structures, so why don't we just keep going? Problem is, as he's going to point out, I believe, is, like I mentioned in the other videos, you have rearranged things, and in doing so, you have caused a diminution of wholeness and the integrality of the whole of all the consciousness structures. They had a they were almost working together as a team, and they figured it out. But now that we have new dimensions and new structures, things need to be reintegrated, things need to be put together in a new way because it's not the same. The parts were more holistic. Once these structures had evolved and had sort of lived out their lives, now if we just keep going to 40, 50, 60, 70, it's going to be chaos and no one's going to be able to do anything. He says, we have just spoken of a quote-unquote gain in connection with the word progress or progression, which terms, as we noted earlier, also express a loss. This particular configuration expresses something that from a dualistic vantage point we could consider positive inasmuch as it contains an increase. But it also expresses a negative aspect since the increase is faced by a decrease or loss on the ledger. The predominance of this progressive increase leads to disintegration and ultimately even to atomization. So if you keep accruing more dimensions, again, it just becomes a bunch of antagonistic parts rather than a cohesive whole. There is no cohesion between the separate consciousness structures, and they're all more antagonistic to one another than a psychic atomization. Then you have the deficient aspects of whatever consciousness structure is predominant in you. Here we arrive at the particular juncture where the anxiety of our age is so much in evidence. The either-or of dualism comes into prominence as an unbridgeable alternative and threatens to place everything in doubt. We are presented with the choice. Either we must have progress as advocated and promised by the exoterics, i.e. the technicians and technocrats, more of the quantification and progression away from origin, or we must undergo a return to origins as preached by the esoterics, i.e. the occultists. In either case, forcing the wheel forward or turning it back. We are confronted with an illusion as illusory as any mere forward or backward motion as such. Remember the mental consciousness structure video. How does it bring objects in the world into relation with each other? Posit one thing, it's either this or that, true or false. In this case, We either go forward and progress on the path we're already walking down, and in doing so, all we're doing is running into the jaws of deficient rationalism. So no one has any meaning anymore, which is all obviously going to be awful. Science is the end all be all. Efficiency is the only thing that matters. Myth is gone. Like I said, any meaning systems, everything becomes this sterile, divided, hyper atomized, and individualized dynamic or circumstance. Or we could go backwards and try to relive some glorified version of the past where we pretend rationality doesn't exist, and then we throw out vaccines and we throw out medicine and we throw out all this great stuff. This is either or dualism and is rationalism, and it is deficient. Do not do it. You do not need to fall into the one or the other. You can transcend to a rationality. Now, this is also a political problem in modern day, in March 2025. The great thing about Gebser, it's not just history, right? You can apply these things to modern life, to modern play. You can make connections. You can see it in modern every day that you wake up and you engage with the world. You will find it. Now, politically, so like you said, on one hand we have the exoterics, which is deficient rationalism as the end all be all, and then the other we go back to some glorified past, and in doing so we forego all this great stuff. This is also sort of found politically now. The political right really, really struggles with this either or dualism. Now, from their perspective, of course, they do not like the political left's political philosophy and vision because if for no other reason, it just negates theirs. So they have been presented a false choice. They take stock and they say, we can either go forward, now remember, it's from their perspective, and run off a cliff with the left because they're running us off a cliff, and we can do that and run towards our demise, or we can look backwards, romanticize some and glorify some epoch like 300 or 400 years ago, and just try to relive that, pretending that different consciousness structures didn't accrue, different historical events hadn't accrued, different needs, different desires, different memories. It's absurd. It's laughable. This is why you see all these guys. Especially the post-liberal right, but I've realized today actually that they're really the pre-liberal right because they always go back. They buy into the either or dualism, so it's either go forward into suicide from their perspective with the left, or go back to whatever some monarchy. I mean, these guys are unironically advocating for monarchies. It's just absurd. I mean, maybe I'll do another video on it, but it's just insane. So don't buy into this either or dualism. There is more. You do. Now, sometimes it can work, but a lot of the times it's very deficient. Let's see. He says this alternative, a symptom of the predicament of the mental structure in its quantitative rationalistic phase, can have accordingly only a limited validity. Its validity can extend no further than that of dualism itself. From an integral standpoint, it is merely a pseudo-alternative, a quote-unquote solution, if at all, only in the form of a synthetic compromise whose effect is almost entirely restricted to the mental conceptual world. It is, in a word, ultimately no solution at all. So from the integral standpoint, I see this for what it is, deficient rationalism. So whatever validity this has, it doesn't mean anything because it's you've sectored off a part from the whole and transposed the whole into the part. But of course, if you haven't sort of achieved quote unquote integral there or integral consciousness, then you are the fish in water. You need to be taken out of the water so you can see, hey, there's a rock in your way. And if you keep going, you're going to drown and you're not going to get anything. So just go around it, and then there you go. Let's see. Here the dualistic trinitary conception of the world reaches its own limits. Even the attempt to transcend this conception, as is recurrently undertaken by philosophy, is illusory to the extent that any transcendence is inseparably bound to spatial and measurable criteria. Only phenomena that are spatially limited can be transcended, that is, crossed over or gone beyond, and temporal limits or fixed terms can be exceeded only in the language of banking and finance. So if I'm transcending, if I want to transcend to the spiritual world, I'm presupposing that I'm locked in to a particular spatial world, in this case, Earth. Now, of course, gravity and just the basic laws of physics will prevent me from, on my own free will, transcending. I don't even know how I want to do this and becoming part of the spirit world. It's just not going to happen. But the point is, it's spatialized. So even then, you're trying to transcend this, but in doing so, you are doing it from the deficient rationalist perspective. So you're never going to be able to do it because you've got the wrong. Um, you're not analyzing it right. You don't see. You're walking into the trap you made for yourself, essentially. The spatial character incident to any attempt at transcendence, quote unquote, adjust the very attempt in both senses of the word. It aims towards a further emphasis on mental consciousness and being in the right, and thus toward further perspectivistic rigidity, and also adjudges or passes final judgment and condemnation on itself. It says this dimensioning of the structures encompassed by the problem of measure and mass is not a question of gains or losses then, unless we wish to remain in the cul-de-sac of dualism with its extremes. Nor if we consider the increment of dimensions as an illustration or an expression of mankind's development, is it concerned with either a descent or an ascent of mankind, positions held by the traditionalists and the evolutionists respectively, who in the one instance cite the demonstrable loss of certain capabilities in man, and in the other point to the demonstrable new technical triumphs. So it's kind of hard to accept at first, but what Gebser's doing is he's saying this, either we gained or we lost. We either improved or we regressed. That's rational thought. Now, that can be okay, but he is going to make the argument that it is deficient, and we'll get into why. Um, but everyone does this to an extent. I mean, the left calls themselves progressives. I mean, that there you go. I mean, it's clearly an aspect. When he is when he shuns the progress model, I think we've all heard of that, even in just grade school, even just the watered down version in grade school. And you probably believed it. And I think I did too when I was a kid. Like, yeah, when I was young, I thought, of course, we're living at, I don't say the end of history, but we're living at the apex, the culmination, because we have all this great stuff. I can go to the store, I can play PlayStation, I can be safe and live to 90 years old as long as I'm healthy and don't get in an accident. But again, the question that comes that is downstream, the idea of, are we going forward or backward? Are we progressing or regressing? That's downstream of rational thought. And I think Gebser is going to make the argument that that turns into rationalism. So he says, who in one instance cite the demonstrable loss of certain capabilities in man, and the other point to the demonstrable new technical triumphs. We'll get there. Both parties, however, ignore the fact that this is not a question of gain or loss, but of restructuration. So there you go. At one time, man himself, or more precisely, the human body, was the instrument of sight or thought across distances, television and telesthesia, or the perceptor of the faint radiation of the aura, while today man fashions instruments for such purposes. So in Magic Man, we were our own technological objects. We were our own technology. It's as he says, we were the instrument of sight or thought across distances. This is not an opinion as to the value of the natural or the lack of value of the artificial instruments. Yet the very fact of the quantity, indeed the quantification of the constructed artifacts, could well cause us to reflect on the phenomenon even where we are speaking of valuable precision instruments. Detractors of such instruments will decry them as being substitutes, defenders will point to the enchantment they bring, and both will be able to marshal weighty arguments to defend their positions. But this conflict of opinion does not resolve the problem. It merely achieves the temporary triumph of the one or the other opinion. So, if you're familiar at all with Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, what does that mean? Society is affected more by the medium it uses to communicate a message than the content of said message. It's trying to speak to the profundity that the media we use has on society, and of course, I think with the internet, we've all had that forced upon us. What it was either Postman or McLuhan, but they said for every media extension, so everything that we use or every new technology, there's a corresponding diminution in our natural abilities. So the car means we are going to walk less. That's a classic example. Of course, the rationalists are going to argue, is this good or is this bad? But you can make both arguments, as you could see. Well, you could say, well, if I use a car, I can go to work, I can make more money, and I can secure my children's future, maybe move them to a neighborhood that's safer or at better schools, and I can go to the store, I can do all this daily stuff in life, right? But then others will say no, because you just destroyed the community. You just destroyed the neighborhood, and the neighborhood, the sense of, or the drive for community and social engagement is, though probably quantifiably immeasurable, probably more powerful than any sort of economic concerns that you're worried about. ChatGPT is another good example. ChatGPT gives us all this knowledge in the world, but in doing so, I even see this in myself sometimes. Sometimes I rush to look something up when I don't need to. I could just think it out if I just slow down and think it out. At the same time, last night I was reading T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland in bed on my phone, but from ChatGPT. It gave me the whole thing. Um, there's good and bad. There's once you get into this, the problem is viewing it as a progression or regression. Why is that? Merely achieves the temporary triumph of one or the other opinion. Yet to the extent that the machine is an objectivation or an externalization of man's own capabilities, it is in psychological terms a projection. We have already spoken of the decisive role of projection in the emergence of consciousness. It is only because of these projections, which render externally visible the powers lying dormant within man, that he is able, or more precisely, that it is possible for him to become aware of this intrinsic potentiality which is capable of being comprehended and directed. So these consciousness structures, these ways of bringing objects in the world into relation with each other, in many ways they are projections. And we know this because the integral structure retracts these projections. It recognizes them as such, and it retracts them so it can say, no, 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 this is mental thinking right here, or this is mythical or magical. We're retracting the projection. He says, all quote unquote making, whether in the form of spell casting or of the reasoned technical construction of a machine, is an externalization of inner powers or conditions, and as such their visible outward form. Every tool, every instrument and machine is only a practical application of inherent laws, laws of one's own body rediscovered externally. All basic physical and mechanical laws such as leverage, traction, bearing, adhesion, all construction such as the labyrinth, the vault, etc., all such technical achievements or discoveries are pre-given in us. Every invention is primarily a rediscovery and an imitative construction of the organic and physiological pre-given symmetries or laws in man's structure, which can become conscious by being externally projected into a tool. Pretty cool stuff. So, of course, when an engineer or Einstein is, well, engineer's probably better. When an engineer is creating something, a piece of technology, the radio, whoever invented the radio, he had to reflect inward. Of course, he got sense from the external world, but he had to reflect inward and work it out in his mind. He had to discover it internally, and then once he got it in here, he projected it externally, and then we got the radio. So, okay, we'll get to the next paragraph, but I think that's what he's getting at when he says it's exactly what he said. Leverage, traction, all laws such as leverage, traction, bearing, any of those laws, the laws of traction or adhesion or whatever, they're within us first. They are projections based on a particular consciousness structure that we externalize and correspond with in the external world. He says this is equally true of the natural capacities at the disposal of magic man we spoke of. Excuse me, let me try that again. This is equally true of the natural capacities at the disposal of magic man we spoke of above, such as telesthesia and telepathy, but it is not true of our radio and television. Today, European man supersedes, that is, excludes time and space by utilizing such contrivances, since he is caught up in the consciousness-sustaining world of space and time, and is scarcely able to achieve this supersession any longer by himself. Magic Man does not need this exclusion at all, since he lives and moves and is absorbed in a spaceless, timeless world of which he is a part. In this respect, the active yogis are not miracles but natural occurrences. The miracle would be if such phenomena or events, unbound by space and time, did not have their place in the spaceless, timeless world. So, Hold on. So Magic Man, as we talked about in the magic consciousness structure, lived in a spaceless, timeless world. But of course, as new dimensions accrued, one of them being space in the mental structure, we now have space. And of course, with the integral, we have time, really space-time. So technology is less, should not be considered as, is this good or bad, or is the good outweighing the bad, or whatever its consequences. What it really is, it is a restructuration of consciousness so we can reattain the feeling, I guess, or the existence of a spaceless, timeless world. So in a spaceless, timeless world, as Magic Man, when I'm the instrument of sight and sound and thought, my entire world is pretty much whatever's in whatever can be encompassed visually by whatever I'm looking at. Of course, with the discovery of perspectivity in space in the mental structure, hundreds or tens of thousands of years later, we realize that's not true, right? Object permanence becomes a little more resonant. So the technology, the technological objects that we recreate are spaceless and timeless. So we are using them. They are necessarily they're necessary in order so we can reaffirm ourselves and return to the spaceless, timeless aspect of our consciousness. The European has for the most part forfeited these capacities through the unfolding of consciousness and has replaced them by their projected or objectivation or externalization into television and radio. He says the giant telescopes belong to the same context inasmuch as Magic Man quote unquote saw and quote unquote knew those phenomena which we quote unquote discover via such instruments, though in a merely optical and sectoral form. We might also say that we would not have such instruments if we did not possess within ourselves the genuine capability of such achievements as they permit. So exactly that. So as we forfeited and traded off our spaceless timelessness, which I think it's sort of implied conferred a certain unity on the psyche, we've replaced them with technological gadgets and innovation, or inventions, I should say. This is an interesting one. This consideration also points up the limits of technology, for technology is definitely unable to bestow on man the omnipotence which he imagines himself to have. On the contrary, technology necessarily leads to an quote omn-impotence to the extent that the process of physical projection is not realized. It is, for example, a requirement of a projection that it not be left without temporal limits. It must be integrated. Such integration is possible only if the projection is retracted, and retraction can be realized only out of a new consciousness structure. So the mental retracts the mythical retracts the magical. Psychic projections can be undone only by conscious mental understanding. Does this perhaps suggest that the material physical projections can be resolved through the integrating spiritual capacity of diaphany? Be that as it may, we have in any event a possibility of resolving the problem of technology, a problem which cannot be solved merely by further technological advancement. So let's focus less on whether technology is good and bad, and instead the consciousness structure that created it. Why is it there in the first place? To reattain the spaceless timelessness that Magic Man once knew. Once we have an understanding of that, and once we have an understanding of why it was needed, I think we can restructure and view technology in a different way. This is why it's here. If possible, now that we know why it's here, now that we know what aspect of the human condition it plays to, let's focus on the aspect of the human condition it plays to and not the technology itself. Technology is downstream from us. Let's focus on us first and get over this idea of, well, is all this technological process good or all is it bad? It doesn't matter. It's necessary. It was necessary because our consciousness rearranged when the mental consciousness structure and the integral structure mutated. We accrue new dimensions, and to attain any sort of psychic unity or psychological unity, we have to live or project the spaceless timelessness into the technological inventions. Let's see. He says the rearrangement of certain capacities in man from the qualitative natural instrumentality of early man into the externalized instrumentality of the machine entailed more than the mere quantification. The objectivation should free and has freed energies for new tasks. So there you go. Early man, for instance, with his merely vital or magic powers, was not able to think in our sense. And yet it would be an injustice to regard this as a negative or deficiency, as traditionalists generally do, for this is equivalent to questioning the sense or meaningfulness of life, a struggle between the senseless and thus undirected and irrational, and the meaningful and directed, which, not being solely mental rational, but rather embedded in the organic event, comes to awareness in the mental structure. Let's see. Be that as it may, of interest here is the observation that the evolutionistic conception, which is forward directed toward the future, is, in its one-sidedness, just as illusory as the traditionalistic attitude which, by responding only to the once dominant unity, turns toward the past. Political right, there you go. This way of approaching things, which today elicits an anxious response in mankind and drives it even further into the narrows, is itself an outgrowth of this very anxiety. The dualism causes anxiety, and we're about to figure out why. Now, this is important for personal development too. You can realize we have to remember Gebser at the end of the day, he's kind of a little bit of everything, but he also is a psychologist, and he studied under Jung, so he knows what he's talking about. He says, let us pause for a moment and turn our attention to this question of anxiety as it is immediately illuminating for our discussion. In particular, we would point out the connection between anxiety, angst, and narrow, eng, E-N-G. Since the concept of angst bandied about is a puffery of partly magic and partly mythical components that unnecessarily activate in us deficient powers rather than efficient energies of the magic and mythical consciousness structures, and confuse rather than clarify our present situation. I'm not entirely sure what he's referencing, but there must have been a lot of talk about the angst, and of course oh man, it's the underlying, or it's the causal or ideological through line. So the take Joseph Campbell. I thought I had spoke. Joseph Campbell, for example, he studied myth and he analyzed all the myths from not all of them, but a lot of the myths from all the different cultures, and he realized that there was an underlying story being told, and that, of course, is the hero's journey. So it's underlying. Or Goethe, I believe, his idea of the plant. Every plant goes through a series of contractions and expansions until it produces a leaf. It is a consistent ontological, which is a fancy word for being, sort of through line. It must go through this. That's so there. What angst must mean is that there is an underlying anxiety that is probably buried in the subconscious of individuals and the collective society at large. Those those who foment this anxiety are, depending on their predominant structural constitution, of a vitalist and emotionalist or psychistic and even quote-unquote nothing but psychological bent respectively. They are abetted by those occultists who indiscriminately activate the basic powers of these structures, which they have failed to perceive. In the wake of their agitations, these individuals, if they come to a realization of what has occurred, are amazed whenever their non-conscious deeds, inevitably magic, menacingly turn back upon them, making them victims of their own actions. Incapable of withstanding the powers they have unleashed alone, they are now the hunted who dispense angst and feign leadership, if only the leadership of the herd. So clearly, the people talking about angst, and that is doing nothing but tripping up deficient magical and mythical aspects of the consciousness of their respective consciousness structures. Clearly, he's not a fan. And then he says that's what happens when you get super angry. You're not tapping into the efficient magical structure. You're tapping into the deficient magical structure. And this is, of course, why you do things out of anger, and it always worsens things. That's what happens to me. I do it. He says anxiety, whether in the life of the individual, the clan, the nation, or of humanity itself, inevitably comes about where the lack of alternative becomes consciously or unconsciously evident in a particular attitude or stance, where it reflects the impotence rather than the potency of the particular attitude. We're going to do that again because that was good. Anxiety inevitably comes about where the lack of alternative becomes consciously or unconsciously evident in a particular attitude or stance where it reflects the impotence rather than the potency of the particular attitude. So if anxiety comes about being presented with options and all of them being deemed unsatisfactory, I think you can probably see how the deficient either or dualism of rationalism creates anxiety. Like you said, you either go forward into the progress and run yourself off the cliff, or you run backwards into the jaw of the monster. That's going to produce some anxiety, and that anxiety is going to manifest itself in ways that are detrimental to society. Anxiety is always the first sign that a mutation is coming to the end of its expressive and effective possibilities, causing new powers to accumulate which, because they are thwarted, create a narrows or constriction. At the culmination point of anxiety, these powers liberate themselves, and this liberation is always synonymous with a new mutation. In this sense, anxiety is the great birth giver. So the only good thing about anxiety is a new structure is most likely going to emerge, and it'll put to rest for now the anxiety of the rationalism, in our case. He said, it is no accident that the anxiety orgies of the Renaissance. I bet you weren't expecting to hear that word today. The dances of death and the doomsday extravagances come to an end precisely when perspective became an effective force through the efforts of Leonardo da Vinci. So all the war that was going on in the Renaissance, it seemed to chill out for a little bit once the new consciousness structure firmly placed itself in charge. Once Leonardo da Vinci discovered perspectivity and sort of shared it, then things chilled out. Now, obviously, it wasn't exactly peace and rainbows, but these orgies of anxiety. Someone tell a friend, okay, we got orgies in town, but not the fun ones. Have a causal connection with the breakthrough to the requisite new dimension of the world which constituted the three-dimensional perspectival world in its final form. The orgies of anxiety, the doomsday phantasmagoria, and the mass psychoses of our day may well be phenomena that parallel those of the Renaissance. So the anxiety caused by the mythical consciousness structure, which was sort of fought out and eventually won by the mental structure. Perhaps World War II is similar in that the deficiencies and the anxiety produced by deficient rationalism will now be superseded by the integral structure, hopefully, because God, Lord knows we need it. He said the line of questioning pursued earlier that calls into question progress on the one hand, as well as any reattachment to the past on the other, both elicits and is elicited by anxiety. To the why are we even taking stock in the first place? I don't know. Maybe it's because all the to quote the great movie Patton, the entire freaking world was at war. I think that produces a little bit of anxiety. And that anxiety will cause you to say, well, let's slow down and let's think of things through. Are we improving our situation or are we going backwards? And I think that's at least understandable. Um, and to the extent that the problem is posed today in terms of alternatives, any unilateral solution is an illusion because it is temporally and mentally, even mentalistically, conditioned. The advocates of one solution adjust their sights to quantitative steps. Advocates of the other place their hopes on unfathomable. But positive or negative, both sides are addicted to a mental rational conception of the world, which is one-sidedly quantitative, dualistic, and fragmenting, as well as being transitory, the fact that only very few seem to consider. Here it is. What is at stake here is neither a loss nor a gain, neither an ascent nor a descent, but a rearrangement or a restructuration, a mutative unfolding that is both positive and negative in the terrestrial arena. In other words, in the space-time world where it appears and is fulfilled. I will repeat for emphasis, because he puts it way better than I do. What is at stake here is neither a loss nor a gain, neither an ascent nor a descent, but a rearrangement or restructuration, a mutative unfolding that is both positive and negative in the terrestrial arena. In other words, in the space-time world where it appears and is fulfilled. I know the natural attitude is to say, to do exactly that. Let's are we gaining or are we losing? But these are necessary restructurations of consciousness. Again, we used to be the own instruments of sight and sound. We'll traded in those abilities for new dimensions, but we like the feeling that that gave us, so we invent technological inventions that through the medium which we can reattain the spaceless timelessness. But quote unquote outside this battlefield, arena, scene, and proving ground, to the extent that we can even speak here in an in inappropriate spatializing terms of a quote-unquote outside, is located that quote core, which is scarcely touched by terrestrial matters because it is itself only tangential to them. And this quote-unquote core or nucleus is in all likelihood identical to the presence of origin, and as such also forms, shapes, and directs each and every individual human being. So rationalists, this is when you click off the video, because now we are leaving the terrestrial world, the physical world, and now we're getting into some transcendent stuff, some spiritual stuff, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, maybe it's not, but whatever it is, it's very difficult to account for rationally. So thank you guys so much. We'll end it there. I'm always trying to improve these. I do apologize if sometimes I stumble over my words or I don't do the best. I am trying. And I apologize if I fail in some regard. Please just let me know, and I'll do my best to write things down. I think sometimes I'm better writing than I am speaking, but nonetheless, I want to do this series. So thank you guys again. You guys are the best. I appreciate you guys watching and engaging with me, and I am so excited to finish this section, because look, I got a whole bunch of stuff written down here. We got a lot of good stuff. So look at that. Huh? This one page is going to be 3 hours. My goodness. My kid's going to be born by the time I'm done this section. All right. You guys are the best. I love you guys. And I'll see you.